Hello and welcome to Unit 4, Lecture 6, our last lecture in Unit 4. Our topic today will be Gilded Age Politics and Reform. Gilded Age was a term that Mark Twain developed. He wrote a book entitled The Gilded Age, in which he gave an extremely negative account to the politics and corruption that was occurring during this era of industrialization. So today we're going to take a look at basically the national level of corruption. It was also, this corruption was also involving local and state government as well, but we will tackle that in an upcoming unit on progressivism. So like I said before, the Gilded Age was a term coined by Mark Twain, and he described the era as an era that looked really good from the outside. There was kind of a thin layer of glitter covering up all of the greed and corruption. All of this wealth that had been accumulated had been built upon greed, corruption, deceit by politicians. He was very he didn't like the job that Congress was doing whatsoever. He was very leery about Congress and the corruption in Congress. He didn't really have any faith in the United States Congress whatsoever. So let's take a look at presidents. This all started during Ulysses S. Grant's 2 terms, his administration. Right after the Civil War, he came after Andrew Johnson. We already took a look at the scandals that he was involved in, credit mobilier, and so forth. So let's move on to President Garfield. President Garfield was elected in 1880, but he would become the second president to be assassinated. He didn't serve very long, and he was assassinated by an angry immigrant, an angry office seeker who expected to get a certain job after working on Garfield's campaign. So this goes all the way back to the spoil system that Andrew Jackson had created. And the spoil system was responsible for much of the corruption that was occurring at the time. So President Garfield was assassinated, and it led people to think this.
And I just want to scream, what now? I just can't figure it out.
And so the spoil system had gotten completely out of control, and so Garfield's vice president, Chester Arthur, assumed the presidency, and he responded by passing the Pendleton Act, which pretty much ended the spoil system. It created the Civil Service Commission and required a majority of government appointees to have to pass a qualifications test to be able to serve in the job that they were appointed. The Civil Service Commission would monitor elected officials, especially at the local level, to make sure that they were, not accepting bribes and, things of that nature. So this was the first step in getting rid of much of the corruption that had begun to plague American politics. Grover Cleveland was elected in 1884, and he was a Democrat, the first Democrat since prior to the Civil War. Now, Cleveland was a very conservative Democrat, and that's probably why he was elected. But he responded by issuing the Interstate Commerce Act. One of the biggest complaints of lower class and farmers was the railroad, and the railroad was just gouging people. There were not many railroads. There was not much competition between the railroads, and so the rates were ridiculously high, especially for short haul. If you had to go a greater distance, usually, you might have more competition, more choices, but some cases, some of the short distances, there was only one railroad, and so you were paying extremely high rates. And people that were shipping goods on the railroad, this was probably their greatest cost. And so the Interstate Commerce Act was the first time that government regulated any sort of industry. They stepped in and they got involved, and they told the railroads that they had to charge a rate based on distance traveled. So it might be $1 a mile, $2 a mile, or whatever it may be. But this was, to get rid of the practice of charging much more for shorter distances than they were longer distances. So this did have some impact and was the first step in the government becoming more involved in regulation of the industry. And remember, prior to this, during laissez-faire, the government wasn't regulating industry at all, and that's why the industrialists were having such great success. Now there was going to be a change, and slowly but surely the government would start to step in to protect the consumer. Grover Cleveland was defeated in 1888. We'll get back to him in a minute. He was the only president ever to be elected, serve 4 years, then be defeated, then come back 4 years later and be elected again. So he served 2 terms, but they weren't consecutive. Meanwhile, in 1888, a Republican, Benjamin Harrison, who was a grandson of William Henry Harrison, was elected. And he was also hearing, all of this complaining of the power of the industrialists. And so he passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was an attempt to break up monopolies and trusts. And really what it did was harm the unions in the long run, because there was really no effective means of enforcing it. So he kind of passed it, and I'm not so sure that he believed that it could be enforced, so he maybe passed it to, settle some of his critics down a little bit, some of those that were, crying about all of the power that the industrialists had created. But again, it was a step toward regulation, a step toward the government not allowing this to happen. It just was not effective at this particular point in time. The second topic that we're going to tackle today is reform. Reform, the people started to demand reform, and eventually the government had to listen to this movement as it became more powerful. Really, the people that started this whole movement were journalists, and these journalists became known as muckrakers, and we're going to be talking about them for the next 30 or 40 years in the time period that we're studying. They took it upon themselves to let the public know about all the abuses that were going on. And then once the public became more knowledgeable, the public could demand action by the government. Some of the important muckrakers of the time were Upton Sinclair. He wrote a significant book called The Jungle, which we'll talk about when we get to the progressives. It was a book that described the horrors of the meatpacking industry. Jacob Riis had his book How the Other Half Lives, which had many photos in there of the poor and the conditions that the poor lived in. And Ida Tarbell wrote an expose on John Rockefeller, the history of the Standard Oil Company and all of the practices and cutthroat moves that he had made to establish a monopoly in the oil industry. All of these books, it's kind of like Dateline Undercover or Expose, which are 48 hours, which are meant to, alert the public to things that, are wrongdoings in society today. So really the goal, of the muckrakers were to alert the public.
What's going on? What's going on? What's going on?
Jane Addams was a reformer that believed in helping the poor. And so she started the Hull House movement, which these were houses that were built in cities to shelter the poor, provide food. They did a lot of education. They taught English. Many immigrants ended up in these Hull houses. So she was one of the first people to, do anything to help the less fortunate during this time. Obviously, we have places like the Poverello Center in Missoula and other shelters that are out there for the homeless and the poor, and they kind of are, the same idea of Jane Addams and the idea of the Hull House. The Blue Laws were an attempt at reform by Republicans in politics. They were an attempt to control personal behaviors. One example is you could not purchase alcohol on Sundays. There are still many states that have that law in effect today. Really, I'm not sure how effective they were. Again, they were aimed at getting rid of some of the problems, ills of society at the time.
Help me
Lastly, the African Americans were still having trouble in the South. The Jim Crow laws had been established, which really legalized segregation. We'll get more into this in detail in an upcoming unit. However, they formed an organization called the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which decided that they were going to fight for the rights of African Americans to end segregation and all the other abuses that they were suffering through demonstrations, boycotts, and lawsuits. And this organization would become extremely powerful. It's still around today. It's one of the most powerful organizations in America, even today. So to end this unit, just review today's lecture. The Gilded Age was meant as a satirical name given by Mark Twain, and there were many, many problems in society and government that had been created because of the corruption and lack of interest by government officials to protect its citizens. And so through this period of time, you had people start to demand that the government look out for a majority of people, not a minority.